Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Up until the end of last decade, Israel attached great importance to the views of European institutions. Europe seemed headed towards some form of a loosely confederated continent with a common foreign and security policy. There was a great deal of alignment between the membership of the EU and NATO, which was relevant to Israel, because under the American division of responsibility it fell under the European command, of course, and because the United Kingdom was still a member of the European Union. With changes in all of these parameters, Jerusalem now prefers to concentrate on its bilateral relations with the nations and governments of Europe. Is that necessary, effective, and irreversible? Joining us to dissect these matters, all the way from the Netherlands, is Professor Oren Rosenthal, formerly Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of the Netherlands.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure indeed. And from Finland, Helsinki, we're joined by Timo Soini, formerly a Minister of Foreign Affairs and Deputy Prime Minister of Finland. It's good to see you as well, Timo.
Likewise. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure indeed. With me in the studio, of course, our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, set the stage for us.
Well, as you know, the founding fathers of Israel believed that Israel will have a continuous cycle of wars with some intervals between the fighting rounds. And therefore, Israel had routine foreign relations, but was geared towards what would happen during war, which is why it had its alliance, the brief alliance with Great Britain and France in 1956, why it suffered from the embargo on French munitions in 1967, and why its most formative experience was the cold shoulder it got from NATO members in 1973 under the threat of the oil embargo. And therefore, as the EEC, as the European Economic Community, became the EU, and then Britain joined, Israel naively believed that it would have a better audience, better attention if all of them were together. Brussels became the second most important post in the Israeli Foreign Service after Washington. But then we saw that the various governments and members of European Parliament and other institutions had veto power over pro-Israeli moves, so Israel reverted to try and have good relations with Berlin, with The Hague, with Helsinki, and all the other capitals. Of course, several of them were vehemently anti-Israeli or indifferent. So Israeli foreign policy is a very, very difficult task.
Indeed. Well, let's turn now to Professor Rosenthal. You and also Mr. Soini, for that matter, were just a couple of months ago, or a couple of weeks ago, actually, in Israel and the Gaza Strip, where you also entered into Gaza to see the situation firsthand and had the opportunity to really experience the current state of play when we're talking about the war raging in the Gaza Strip, but also the challenges that have to do with the north and the current deliberations undertaken within the halls of power in both Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. When you hear right now the discourse in Europe, does it align with reality on the ground?
I would say that I was very impressed when I was in Israel and Gaza with the efforts and achievements of the IDF and also the Israeli government to do their best in running this terrible war. And one of the main observations which I took with me back to Europe was actually that there is a remarkable gap between the achievements I mentioned and the way in which they are communicated, definitely also through the diplomatic channels to Europe and to my country. I think that that was one of the outcomes for me of this mission. And I would hope that the efforts of the Israeli government to bring to the fore also on the European end what we have seen during our mission in Israel and Gaza, that would really occur in a straightforward way.
Mr. Soini, what is your experience?
I was also impressed what I saw and what we were also shown. We visited the horrible places in the kibbutz who have been attacked, and also to that field where the music festival took place and people were slaughtered and murdered. So that was very hard to see, but also very, very useful to see where the whole thing, what we are now living through the war and the attacks, where it comes from, what was the root origin of this conflict. It was because of this vicious attack. And I also wrote several articles to the Finnish press about this, and they were quite warmly welcomed because it is one-sided in many of the Western worlds because of the heavy, how would I say, PR operation, what has been ongoing in Western world, especially in campuses of United States funded by Qatar and the other countries. And it came all clear to me that Israel has multiple threats, direct war with Hamas, rockets from Hezbollah, ISIS Jihad, Houthis, but there is this, in a way, sixth front, which is the PR, which is the battle in the publicity, which is one of the most important in times to come, because people are getting worn out because of this war, because it has been taking a long time. The same has happened in Ukraine, and same threat goes on in this one. And that is why this PR, the truth, the harsh truth, must be sorted out and vocally declared. And one more thing which is important now when the new European Commission starts. Borrell was anti-Israel to his fingertips, that we know. But now we have a new commissioner for the foreign policy matters, Mrs. Kaja Kallas, and she comes from a very small country, Estonia, which has a very rough and tough history with Russia. So I would recommend to try to establish a good personal relations to her.
Of course, she up until recently served as the Prime Minister of Estonia and had
yes, that's right. Yeah, that's
various activities to try and convince her neighboring countries to push for the recognition of a Palestinian state. So, of course, there are different matters that need to be taken into context and to raise those questions. Of course, we give everybody the chance to prove themselves before they take a role and assume that position. But Mr. Oren, 2 points I take from what Professor Rosenthal mentioned and Mr. Soini. One, the inability and ineffectiveness of the Israeli government to relay reality on the ground to its counterparts in Europe, in particular, of course, around the world at large, and the failure to really win on the PR battlefield. Of course, Israel is a small country. The capacity to drive algorithms, as is being done by Qatar and the Muslim world, is a lot more challenging because of the small numbers versus the large numbers that fuel the various mechanisms within the internet domains and such. What can Israel do differently to try and improve, since this has been the key issue deliberated for how many years now?
Well, To answer your question directly, what can Israel do? Short of changing its policy or adapting it to what its critics wanted to do, nothing. Because I don't want to downgrade or downplay the importance of media in general and social media, but this is not the main ingredient. The problem is that there are pressure groups, there are sectors with influence on foreign policy, domestic influence in various countries on foreign policy through parliaments, through civic activities. And it is not just because what they see on television or on social media. And Israel has to expand its contacts with these groups. Israel is perhaps too stuck on the old ways of trying to court the establishment. And there are up and coming generations who are not knowledgeable. It is not always a matter of rationality. If you saw our story, and we can't bring everyone here the way Uri and Timo managed to come and visit and see it firsthand. And if some people, some groups, even if they saw it firsthand, would have denied what they saw. So it's very difficult, and I want to touch on another point. There are international organizations. I don't mean UNRWA and these agencies, but if you take, for instance, the two courts in The Hague and the United Nations Security Council, which always has, of course, European representation, it is much more effective for Israel to work either in New York or in the home capital vis-a-vis these countries which represent not Europe. They come, of course, because the continent of Europe has representation in the 10 rotating members of the UN Security Council. But it is not as if Brussels would tell these countries how to vote on resolutions. So it is more effective to work bilaterally.
With regard to the media, I disagree. I think the media has a lot of influence.
TV7 News has a lot of influence, but media in general...
We're talking now that the United States is also pushing for the banning, not only the banning of RT, but the fact that it has been utilized by Russian intelligence for the purpose of changing public opinion and driving all kinds of opinions within the public sphere in the United States is speaking volumes. The fact that the European Union immediately moved and pushed a motion to ban RT in the European continent and failed to do so to channels like Al Jazeera, which is no less potent in the activities that RT is pushing for. The same manner in TRT Turk, which is doing exactly the same amongst the Turkish communities in the Netherlands, in Germany, and elsewhere throughout Europe. I can go on and on with this list of channels. The majority of those are totalitarian regimes or claim to be democratic in one fashion or another. Unfortunately, that's not the case. And it's not only Israel's fault in this context, I believe. I think that the European nations should also protect their own sovereignty and citizens from those threats and dangers. But Professor Rosenthal, when we're hearing EU foreign policy chief, who just traveled to Egypt a couple of days ago, he took part in the Arab League, during the course of which he highlighted that, in his opinion, Israel was committing crimes against human rights and all kind of other claims that are baseless, but are, according to his own words, based on his information received from Al Jazeera. What are we to take out of that, and why is he so detached from reality when we're talking about Israel, Europe, and its interest in the Middle East?
To take it to the heart of the matter, when we talk Europe, you know, we have always had our culprits vis-a-vis Israel. And when I was a minister already more than 10 years ago, it was already completely clear that countries like Ireland, Spain, Malta, and also even then Norway were on the wrong side of the story. and that hasn't changed. At the same time, I would say that in Europe at large, looking at the member states, the center of gravity in some ways has shifted, or at least an emphasis has shifted towards the Central and Eastern Europe. And there the overall picture vis-a-vis Israel is better. And when I look at the Netherlands and Germany, for instance, our new foreign minister, for a former ambassador of our country in Israel, in Tel Aviv, has been very firm over the last days that there can be no way in which the Netherlands would not stand behind Israel in its fight for self-defense and what have you. And even the more he also was very clear that in Brussels the situation should definitely change. And Timo was already mentioning it. I would say that we can be slightly optimistic about a change of power in the foreign affairs in Brussels from this terrible guy, Josep Borrell, to Kaja Kallas, and the more so, some of the strongest positions in the European Commission have been given now to people whom I'm also rather optimistic about. For instance, one of the top positions in the European Commission will be with Mr. Fitto, Raffaele Fitto from Italy, who is endorsed by Prime Minister Meloni. So I see in Europe at large, I see some positive signs as well. And what you were talking about, a high-power people who are simply following suit on the misleading messages which are going through the mainstream and especially social media, I would say, well, I'm happy that there are also other voices at the European end.
Thank you, Professor. Mr. Soini?
I agree with Yuri. I have also met Raffaele Fitto many times. She used to be the chair of the ECR group in the last term in the European Parliament before becoming a minister, and now as a commissioner. I'm cautiously optimistic on that. And I also agree what Yuri said about Spain and Ireland. It was, of course, a big disappointment that they recognize the state of Palestine. It's not a state, it's a kind of governmental organ, whatever it is. But the Spain especially is very hypocritic in this issue, because Kosovo is in the middle of the Europe, and Spain hasn't recognized Kosovo, and for obvious reasons, because of Catalonia and so forth. And now it makes a moral viewpoint against Israel by recognizing Palestinian authority. If we look at if the authority is Fatah, it is corrupted, or is it Hamas, which wants to destroy Israel? It's not very, how would I say, peace-loving policy. And Ireland has a history what comes to IRA, the cooperation with Libya and other so-called terrorist states when they were battled their own independence battle. So this is rather short-sighted on their side, but these recognitions, they are still important, because there is a balance in the European Union with the countries who has recognized and who has not. And there are big countries like Germany, which obviously hasn't recognized it, and UK outside the European Union, but in in the middle of the Europe in itself, and there is now a new government in UK. But I don't think that Starmer is that stubborn, anti-Semitic at all. But Jeremy Corbyn clearly was, and these are very important things that when you making the cooperation systems, both in the way the direct cables to the capitals and in the European Union, as Amir before said. So the both ways must be used.
Indeed. Mr. Oren, Europe is nonetheless very important to Israel. It has 2/3 of Israeli economy is reliant on the European continent. Of course, Great Britain is very much a significant partner of Israel on the economic sphere, and although, as mentioned, the new government in the UK is showing some worrying trends when we're talking about the export of weaponry, it's the British exports of weaponry or munitions, some 130 some tenders, is roughly 1% of Israel's entire imports of munitions.
Doesn't matter, because if there is a critical part in a drone or another important weapon system, it can cost you only a few pounds, but without it, you can't operate.
Well, nonetheless, it is replaceable with additional allies and partners. And with that being said, Britain has always been a very significant ally of the State of Israel. It has been instrumental in defending Israel time and again, not necessarily in international fora, but yes, in the field and in the fora behind the scenes with intelligence communities having very close relations. Where are we heading from here?
Well, this is a very generous reading of the British-Israeli relationship. You are extrapolating from the correct status of the relations between MI6 and Mossad and the rest. But on the policy level, Ben-Gurion used to quote the term perfidious Albion, of course, and there were several instances, including the sale of the Chieftain tank, when Arab pressure brought a change in British policy. But let me mention another issue, because we have two distinguished guests who have been foreign ministers. The power and prestige of the Foreign Service has declined in most countries recently, but it behooves Israel to cultivate relations with the ambassadors from those countries, as well as from the EU, or sometimes there is a lead country which also represents the EU, because these ambassadors go back to their countries and they can be ambassadors of goodwill for Israel if they are taken care of rather than neglected, not only by the Israeli Foreign Ministry, but the Israeli ruling elite in general.
In 45 seconds allocated to each of you, what would you recommend to the Israeli government here in Jerusalem about moving forward on the diplomatic front vis-a-vis Europe? Professor Rosenthal, we'll start with you.
Well, let me be nearly ad personam. When I met Bibi Netanyahu a couple of times, he said literally to me, we have given up on Europe. And I said to him, you would be damned wrong to do so. And the more so because on the European end, we are very keen on seeing whether on appreciating the attention and the energy of the Israeli diplomatic service in connecting to Europe. The idea often is that especially your prime minister is so much focused. Of course, it is understandable on the United States, on America, also in his whole way of communicating, that he is losing actually a sort of connection with his European friends, because they are still there, as I mentioned before. My message would be to take Europe seriously, and especially because the changes in Europe give some sort of chance for changing the balance, which has been so bad over the last year.
Thank you, Professor Rosenthal. Mr. Soini?
I think it is very important to stress to the Europe that what Israel is doing, it is doing it for its own safety, but also for the safety of the Europe. If we took the maritime security and all the ships coming to take materials and components to Europe. And the second thing is very important, that you have a lot of ambassadors accredited to Israel. If you could show some, even at the same kind of treatment what Yuri and myself and the high military ranked retired people, what we experienced, how seriously we were taken care of, and all the questions were answered, even the hard ones, even the tough ones, I would say that then you would get a good bunch of ambassadors to take also your view to the capitals of the Europe.
Thank you to Professor Rosenthal, thank you to Mr. Soini, and thank you, of course, to Mr. Oren. And I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next edition, from here in Jerusalem, Shalom.
Shalom, I'm Danny Ayalon, former Israeli ambassador to the United States, former deputy foreign minister and member of Knesset. Today, I'm very privileged to be hosting TV7's Middle East Review and also being a panelist of the various shows of TV7, which I find the most enlightening, most educating if you really want to understand the world, the global scene as well as the regional scene of the Middle East. It is worthwhile to watch TV7.